Welcome back to the Alts Podcast. I'm your host, Horacio Ruiz. We bring you industry leaders and creators to give their insights on the rapidly changing and exciting world of alternative assets. Opinions expressed on this podcast by the host and podcast guests are for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Podcast hosts and guests may maintain positions in the offerings discussed in this podcast. Our guest today is Alan Goldsher, Head of Content at the sports fractional platform, Collectable. You may know Alan as the voice of Collectable Daily, Collectable's daily podcast, but Alan is also a published author and an accomplished musician. So it was great to have him on the show, talking about his experiences being on a world tour with the Diggable Planets and how he transitioned into other interests and now hosting the Collectable podcast. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Alan. Our guest today is Alan Goldsher, Head of Content at Collectable. Alan, thanks for being on the show.
Well, like I said before we went on the air, one of the most difficult things about doing a podcast, especially when it's a bare bones operation, is getting guests. So when I have the opportunity to help out a fellow podcaster, especially one who works for a really cool company like Alt, I take it. It's my pleasure.
Thanks a lot, man. We appreciate it. You are a multidimensional guy. You've had a music career, you're a published author, and now you're host of a sports fractional investment platform podcast. But I get the sense that music was your first passion. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It was my first passion. It's funny. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and we're putting, I don't want to say pressure. It's more of a mental thing on our end. We want her to find her thing, right? The one thing to focus on, the one thing that she loves. And I actually was talking to her about this the other day. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was 8. I was playing trumpet in the school band. I played that for like 4 years. Did not like it a bit. Once I got into high school, I was introduced to the bass, and I did like that. And I found my thing. I was 13, 14 years old at that point. So I'm asking too much out of my little 8-year-old, but in any event. So yeah, I started playing bass as a freshman in high school, and concurrently was getting into jazz, like hardcore. I was kind of burnt out on the pop music of the day. It was the early 80s, and it was transitioning between the more acoustic stuff that I really loved and then the more kind of electronic stuff. And I just wasn't feeling it at that point. Then jazz fell into my lap. Miles Davis, Chick Corea, just like all this wonderful stuff. And then all of a sudden playing an instrument had a point, right? Instead of just playing it to play it, to get your part right, to learn to do etudes and exercises, I was actually learning songs that I enjoyed. And that gave me some context, and that made me super happy. And just luckily, I got pretty good pretty quickly. And by the time I was 16, 17, I was gigging around Chicago, playing professional gigs, getting paid for it. And at that point, I'm like, okay, I maybe could actually make a living out of this. So rather than go to college, my college was gigging. My college was jazz clubs. My college was moving to New York and gigging around there while simultaneously working at a record label and trying to figure out what path would make the most sense, right? Whether I wanted to pursue playing for a living or pursue helping other people realize their musical dreams. That decision was made for me when my job at the record label was eliminated. So at that point, I was like, all right, I think I'm going to just play music for a living now because I don't have a record label job anymore. And I'm just going to blow past all this stuff. So I'm sure you sent me a really nice outline. So I'm just going to go ahead and answer these questions without you having to ask them. You're welcome. So right around this time, I started playing at a club called Giant Step, which was a pretty, I don't want to say legendary, that's kind of overstating it, but it was a really hot, happening, cool, well-respected club where acid jazz was the general tenor of things. And we'd have some amazing guests. Like one of the most amazing musical moments of my life was when Grandmaster Flash and Melly Mel sat in. Nana Cherry, if you remember her, Guru from Gangstar. Like all these people would come on and hop on the stage and play with us. Right around that time, Diggable Planets dropped their single Rebirth of Slick Cool Like That, and they had the white label out, so nobody knew who it was, but it was being played in our club all the time. So the founder slash promoter, Maurice Bernstein, who's still doing a business called Giant Step not a club, but doing just an all-encompassing media business. He said that this guy from Diggable Planets wants to meet you, and I said, okay, great. I'm always up for meeting new people. So we connected, we vibed. He gave me, the record wasn't done yet, the album wasn't done yet, but he gave me a tape of what they had done, and it was just right in my wheelhouse. A combination of jazz and hip hop with really fat bass lines. So I ended up playing with them. I recorded on that album, recorded on their second album, toured with them for over a year, was lucky enough to see the world. Like there's no way I would have been able to go where I went ever without music taking me there, right? So that went on really well. And I know you had asked about me wanted to hear about me playing on the Grammy Awards. They were nominated for two awards, Best Rap Performance and Best New Artist, and they won one of them. I think it was Best New Artist. But we played, we performed a song, we performed the single "Cool Like That," and we're ridiculously lucky to be joined on the stage by Clark Terry, a legendary jazz trumpeter, just a wonderful person, wonderful player, life highlight, right? Playing on stage with him, looking out in the audience and seeing Bruce Springsteen and Whitney Houston, Frank Sinatra while I'm on stage. It was ridiculous. I will always treasure that day. And, it kind of came to an ignominious end. And at that point, when you're in New York and you don't have a regular gig, you don't have a regular music gig, it kind of gets hard to keep the enthusiasm happening. So I kind of pulled away from the music, and that brings us up to the mid-90s.
How has the music industry changed from when you were playing with the Diggable Planets, in the 90s to now?
That's a great question. The most important thing to note with that question is the entertainment industry in 1990, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus 2020, 21, 22. Two different animals. There are so many more choices now, and add the pandemic into the equation, and there's no parallels, right? We were playing in packed clubs for 1,000, and then in what they call sheds, the outdoor arenas, for like 15,000. And for a band of that stature, that's just not going to happen anymore. And I was very lucky to play for so many people. And the crowd that we were attracting was a real positive crowd, because that first album of theirs was a real positive album, had positive unity messages. So kind of a hippy dippy vibe. The crowd that would come to see us, they'd be sincerely, kind and questioning after the show, asking very pointed and good questions, not just saying, "Oh, dude, you were really good." You'd have a lot of great conversations. I met a lot of great musicians. I was able, through the band, to play. I did a session with the producer from Cypress Hill, and I did a session with the producer from Naughty by Nature, and I ended up being on a Janet Jackson track. And that would have never happened had we not been in that situation. Now it's just everybody can make music at home, so you don't need really to get a bass player or just a special guest star, because you can put your own album out, right? I mean, if they were a new band and they had just come out with their album, yeah, smaller venues, if any venues at all, because of the pandemic. Clubs in Chicago, which is my only point of reference, because I haven't done any traveling over the last couple of years. There are just a very small number of clubs in Chicago where any bands can play, maybe like 5 to 10 tops. And at those clubs, for example, Lincoln Hall, right? They'll have like some pretty well-known singer-songwriters, but they'll also have well-known regional bands who can draw bodies. And since the music industry is so wonky, since there aren't major labels pushing smaller to mid-sized debut bands, yeah, you're kind of on your own traveling right now. You got to do your van tour, you got to sell your merch, you got to sell your own CDs, and CDs isn't even a thing anymore. That's how you supplement your tour, or that's how you pay for the tour with the tour. So it's super frustrating for a musician, which is why, if I may fast forward to 2019, I started my own record label. I started Gold Note Records. I've made like 13 some odd singles, a handful of EPs, 6 albums, all by myself, right? I do it in my house with my sound equipment and my MIDI controller and my bass and my voice. And I just this weekend, as a matter of fact, found out that I have topped the 100,000 stream mark. That's not a big deal because like Taylor Swift, like blows 100,000 streams out of her nose every morning. But for me, who's just a dude in his basement making music, I'm super proud of it.
So, Alan, as you're transitioning, right, as you're going from a touring musician, the tour ends. I was kind of curious, what role did sports play in your life? I mean, is that something that you were always a sports fan and you always kind of kept up with the events? Because then you kind of seem to pivot into sports.
Yeah, I have been a massive sports fan since I was a little itty bitty Allen. Always a Chicago guy, but tried to stay up on everything. The three majors and even a little bit of hockey. When I moved to New York, I kind of lost touch with it because music just was dominating my time. And at that point, you didn't get much in the way of non-local broadcasts. So you'd have to like read a lot of newspapers and watch a lot of Sports Center, blah blah blah. So I always did stay up with my Bears and Bulls and Cubs and White Sox. Yes, I like both Cubs and White Sox. So when I started writing for realsies, like in the late '90s, so one thing, a little piece of advice for you future writers and musicians and any creative out there, you got to put yourself out there. So I figured I want to write about sports, so I'm going to reach out to like every sports magazine I can and try and get some gigs. And I ended up getting a gig with freelance with Sport Magazine, dearly departed Sport Magazine. Wrote a bunch of articles for them. Ended up writing some stuff for ESPN, the magazine. Wrote some stuff for the early iterations of NBA.com and ChicagoBulls.com. And was it 99 or 2000, like right around there, I reached out to the Bulls and ended up getting a bunch of freelance work with their in-house publications, their game programs, and the books they send to season ticket holders. And that was kind of cool in that it taught me a lot about sports journalism, right? The writing itself was a little fluffy because it was for the team, so you couldn't really put any kind of op-ed type stuff in there. You had to write, it was all fluffy profiling, but it taught me how to be a better interviewer with athletes, which is different than interviewing musicians, which is different than interviewing authors, etc. Fast forward to like 2005, what was it, 17 2017, I got a gig with FanDuel. And with FanDuel, I was writing a whole lot of articles. Then we pivoted to podcasting. Just right when Daily Fantasy was blowing up, I was doing a daily podcast for them about the NBA. It was really difficult because I wasn't as knowledgeable as I am now. Audio software was not as intuitive as it is now, but it gave me so much background in doing this, right? It taught me how to do it, how to keep up the energy each day in and day out. And it's hard. You do a weekly show, right? It's hard to do even a weekly show, let alone a daily show. And yeah, it was a challenge, but it was really fun. And the lessons I learned along the way have been so important to me moving here to Collectable.
And so that's kind of like your sports writing side, because you're a multi-dimensional guy, man. And so then we go back. So there's a couple of things tying your music career, your kind of sports journalism, and then you've also like you're like a ghostwriter. You've written your own books, and even within there, right? You've done different things where you're not just stuck on one thing. You're helping people write their biographies, or you're writing about them, and then you also have like a nice little horror a niche that you've done. So you're tying all this together. Can we talk about that for a second, about like your writing and the process, and how that kind of is different or maybe similar to your preparation as a musician or as a podcast host?
The only commonality between all of the writing, the podcasting, and the making music is that I just go for it. I don't have any compunctions about trying different things because that's the way you learn, is to try and make a mistake. I have no compunctions about putting myself out there. But in terms of approach, writing it's like a marathon. Podcasting is a sprint, and music's a hobby in effect. And I don't want to dismiss it. That makes it sound a little flip, but music is fun. Music is this is going to sound weird, it's the least challenging, it comes the easiest to me, right? Podcasting is just it's not a bad grind, but it's a grind, it's a daily grind. Writing, and I haven't written any books in several years, and I don't have any real interest in doing my own books right now. It's so daunting. Writing a book is so daunting. But there was a period when that's what I did, right? So when I was working at this music marketing company, one day I decided I'm going to write a novel. So I've always been a voracious reader. It was a semi-autobiographical novel. It's really bad, but it did get published. And I had a lot of fun. It was fun doing it. It was a huge accomplishment. Seeing it in the stores and seeing it in its finished form was just so inspiring and amazing. So wrote a couple other books, and the horror stuff you were talking about, the first one was it was called Paul's Undead, the British zombie invasion, and it's a retelling of the Beatles story, the Beatles mythology, as if they were zombies. And that came about, and I'm not going to lie here that it was a completely original idea. There was a book that had come out maybe a year prior called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which was a retelling of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice with zombies in it, and it was a huge bestseller, and people were trying to capitalize on that and get in of what they were calling the mashup on the mashup game. And I'm like, I got to do this. I got to get in on it. And I love the Beatles. I love music, so I wrote that, and it did pretty well. It sold. It still blows my mind that it sold like 25,000 copies, which is amazing to me. It means 25,000 people spent money on my stupid little Beatles book. But then I got contracted by St. Martin's Press, one of the major publishers, to do a couple other horror mashups. And I guess those were more parodies than mashups. One was a parody of Sound of Music, and one was a parody of the first Game of Thrones book. And a lot of fun. But then I think I just kind of hit the wall on the horror comedy stuff. Wrote some romantic comedies, and like you alluded to, did a whole bunch of different ghostwriting, worked with some musicians, some comedians. The Ghost project I'm most proud of is the one I did with George Benson, the guitarist vocalist. I'm proud of that one. This is a little how the sausage is made stuff here. George was kind of difficult to pin down, so I based the book on these interviews he did with the Smithsonian Institute, which were terrific interviews, and it's the same kind of interviews I would have gotten on my own had he had the time, but they're only 6 hours worth, and it usually needs to get like a 75 to 100,000 word book. You usually need about 20 to 40 hours of interviews, but I was able to fill in the gaps with my knowledge of music and George, and I'm super proud of that one. Is super proud of that one. Yeah.
That's just awesome how you just, and I think the lesson there is like, and you mentioned it before, is just go ahead and do it. Because if you're curious about something, just go ahead and do it. And I think that that has a lot of carryover into into anything, and specifically right now, since we're kind of talking about collectibles, right? Like if people have an interest in it, or if they want to have a desire to learn more about something, just dive in and see where it takes you. And it seems like it's taking you in a number of different places.
Yeah, I ended up with Collectable after FanDuel, after a couple consulting gigs in the sports space, and it started out slow. I was just doing a few written articles here and there, and then we amped up our content offerings. And for a while, we were doing just written, and yeah, just written. We had a whole website that I called memorabilia adjacent. It was writing about sports in the past and uniforms and cards, but not about like this Mickey Mantle 1952 card is the one to get. It was more just about kind of whimsical, lighthearted look at that section of sports. We decided to pivot almost exactly a year ago to podcasts. It was in February of 2021 where we decided, all right, Alan's going to do a daily podcast. So we spent a month doing sample programs, right? I did maybe like 8, 10 of them. Had to make sure I can get the cadence down to do it every day. Had to make sure that everybody in house felt comfortable with the product. And by the time it dropped on, I think March 1st was our premiere date, we hit the ground running. If you listen to the first show, in terms of tone, it's not too far different from where we're at now. Although now it's, now it's honed, it's tighter, it's strictly interview based. There used to be kind of a news element to it, but now it's just interviews. There's no need for me to rehash the news that anybody could get anywhere else.
I do miss that little jingle where it was like, yeah, it's time for business. It's business time now.
Ah, you are an old school listener. Yeah, that
And
was
one day it wasn't there, and then it came back for maybe a few more days, and then it was gone. I was like, man, that made my day every single time.
Oh, I'm glad. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, but we pivoted because at end of the day, like I was having trouble finding. I would usually be like four stories about the hobby, right? And in 2021, right in that point, like maybe second and third quarter in 2021, something new was happening every day, and then it got to the point where it calmed down a little bit, and there was stuff happening, but it was all within the same umbrella, and the interviews were starting to get really good, right? I was able to get really great guests who were all really insightful, really thoughtful, and brought more to the table than my little, news bits. I credit the longevity to that, because if it were just me, I'm entertaining enough, but I don't think I'm entertaining enough all by my lonesome to merit people coming back day in and day out to listen. But if I have someone on there, like, today we had Darren Herman from Bain Capital, and Darren gave just this wonderful breakdown of the meeting between sports and investing. And he explained it in traditional investing, and he talked about alt investing, and he talked about card investing. And, that's the kind of show that has a little evergreen quality to it. People can go back and refer to it and say, I need to learn about a little more about how this all works. And he gave us a blueprint of sorts, and stuff like that that's really cool. Tomorrow I have Joe Orlando on, who's our new president, sports, and we're going to talk about how the major league labor strife is impacting the hobby. So there's always something to talk about, and I can talk about the same thing every day of the week with five different people and get five different perspectives, and I feel like it's pretty darn listenable, despite the fact that we are talking about the same thing.
Kind of one big question is, what is that grind like, of having the daily show? And you talked about it before, the guests and just kind of the production and everything. But it's like you have to be up, right? You have to be up for that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I legitimately enjoy it, right? If I didn't enjoy it, if it was just a slog to listen to people, that's a problem. But I do enjoy it. One thing that people said to me about the hobby early on is that you're really going to like a lot of the people that are involved. And, I make it a point to have all of my guests, I don't vet them necessarily, but I do talk to them a little bit before they come on. And if I don't think there's a rapport, we'll bang out the episode, but I probably won't have them back again.
Right.
But most of my guests, I've got a pool of maybe like 20, 30 guests who I rotate in. There's some I have each and every month. The guys from Card Ladder I have on each month. Rich Miller from Sports Collectors Daily I have on each month.
Hmm.
Slava Rubin from Vincent Alternative Investments I have on each month. Darren, the aforementioned Darren Herman, I have on each month. I have some of our in-house guys on. I have Joe Orlando on twice a month, have been doing so for the last several months. And I think that's what kind of gives it a nice cadence, is that there's a genuine rapport. We have a good time, and I like to think that comes across on the air. I don't know. Tired of the sound of my own voice, so it's hard for me to listen to it.
No, 100%. And I think that has a lot to do with, like you said, building that rapport and just your desire to listen to people and kind of engage in that conversation. Alan, I was gonna, I thank you for your time. I kind of want, in the interest of time here, kind of come down here and I was not gonna let you go. I need to steal this from you.
Hmm.
Can you give me your Mount Rushmore?
Oh, I knew this was coming.
See, I wasn't gonna put that on the outline. I wanted to surprise you.
Okay, so the backstory of this is I do this little segment with all of my new guests called the Collectable Daily 3, and I have three hobby centric questions. And Horacio's throwing them back at me. All right, my hobby Mount Rushmore. So the way I always position this question is any era, any sport, any athlete. What four guys most represent the hobby? What four athletes?
To you.
To me. And it could be, it could be like, random Steve Oniveros, who's the third baseman for the Cubs when I was growing up. He's not on my list, but Michael Jordan is on my list because he has to be. I'm going to put Walter Payton on there because he's Walter Payton, A, and B, when his memorabilia pops up, people tend to get pretty excited about it. It's not Babe Ruth level prices, but he's enough of an entity to me personally and within the hobby that he belongs on my Mount Rushmore. He's not going to be anybody else's Mount Rushmore, but he's on mine. You have to put Babe Ruth up there. I'm going to tell a little story here because it's hilarious. So we at Collectable last summer, we were involved in a deal in which we had a tiny little piece of this $6 million Babe Ruth Baltimore Sun card. So I think it was like 1 of 5 or something like that. And we went out to Baltimore to the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum to have a press conference to announce it. And I was out there doing, some interviews and did a podcast with the owner of the card, blah, blah, blah. So me and Ezra Levine, our CEO, we did a little interview for camera in front of the pedestal that the card was on. It was a glass enclosed pedestal, maybe like 4 or 5 feet high, thin, probably about like 9 by 9, and then, like I said, 4 feet high, and not exactly the greatest piece of storage for a $6 million card. So I'm talking to Ezra, the camera's on, talk, microphone, and not paying attention to this wobbly pedestal, and my elbow grazed it as I'm putting the mic in front of his face, and it wobbled. It wobbled. There was a $6 million card that had one of the people who work at the museum not rushed in and put their hand in the back of it to steady it. That could have fallen on the ground. So yeah. Babe Ruth.
a sigh of relief.
A sigh of relief by everybody. So what do we got? MJ, Peyton, Babe Ruth, and I don't necessarily want to put 2 Yankees on there. Mantle's got to go on there though, and you might have a sub Mount Rushmore with some of the modern guys, LeBron, Brady, Mahomes, the guys that are just like eliciting these massive sales. But if we're gonna go vintage, MJ, Walter, Ruth, and Mantle.
That's solid, man. That is a solid one.
Thank you.
Listen, it's great listening to you every day. I really enjoy it.
Oh, thanks, man.
There's some great content you guys put out, and a real pleasure talking to you, Alan. I hope we can do this, every so often.
Happy to come back and yammer.
Awesome, man. It was so good talking to Alan. He's an uplifting dude, and it was great to catch his Mount Rushmore of athletes. You can catch Alan on the Collectable Daily, his website, alangoldsher.com, or catch his latest release on your preferred music streaming platform, live at the Lakeview Lounge. If you enjoyed today's podcast, let others know about it. We find our guests so interesting and knowledgeable, and I know others will too. Or leave a review or hit the follow button. Until the next episode, take care.